right, guys, welcome to our week 4 lecture. We're going to talk about several topics, kind of a bigger lecture, but like I said last week, it's hard to get all this stuff in 8 weeks, guys, and I'm trying to give you the stuff I think is most important for you guys to be successful. So we're going to talk about concept of power, politics, conflict, and stress within our organizations. So it's real important that it may not be formally that we study organizational behavior, but we need to understand that within our organization, we want to try to kind of predict what actions are going to lead to other actions and create kind of situations or scenarios where not only ourselves but the people who work for us can be successful. There are a lot of components that go into organizational behavior, but it pretty much comes down to understanding personality, perception of what's going on and people's attitudes. And so if we kind of start to understand the personalities of people we work with, their perception of what's going on and their attitude, we can kind of predict what's going to happen within our organizations. So first thing we need to kind of to talk about is a little bit is personality. So there may be a lot of personality traits, guys. There's pretty much comes down to 5. You have kind of extroversion type people. It's kind of it lies on a continuum of people who are really outgoing versus really shy. You have kind of agreeableness type people, that a personality trait where it kind of falls on a continuum of, are you easy to get along with, or are you difficult to work with? Then there's emotionalism, which kind of falls on a continuum between, are you emotionally stable or unstable? Then how conscientious you are. It kind of falls on a continuum between somebody being responsible on one end and irresponsible on the other one. And then the last one is how much are you open to experience? And it kind of falls on a continuum of that you're not versus you are. So we have to understand the people we work with, where they fall on the continuums of each of these type of personality traits. And so one thing I tell young people, and it really applies to young people, old people, it doesn't matter. When you're in an organization, you have to understand where the power lies in that organization. And this is something that's been hard for people to study, kind of hard to put a definition on. But easiest way to think about it is really it's the ability to get somebody to do something that they don't really want to do. And it's can kind of be seen as a negative sometimes. And authority is just one type of power. And we have to understand in our organization how power is defined. Is it vertically? Is it horizontally? Is there a hierarchy? And when we go into new organizations, we have to quickly understand where the power lies in that organization. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, guys, because we talked about it already before. But there's a couple of ideas of thinking about power. There's legitimate power, which is authority. There's power to give rewards. There's coercive power, meaning you have the ability to punish somebody. There's referent power. It's kind of the person who's has a charisma, able to kind of control people. And then there's expert power, where you have power just because you know more than somebody else. And so within an organization, power can come from a lot of places. And some of that comes with how the organization is defined and how it's designed. And so these are just kind of organization-based sources of power. So the acquisition and the control of resources. So obviously, the person who has the ability to control resources has power. Now you have to go about how you want to define resources. The ability to cope with uncertainty. So somebody who are organizations that are constantly having to deal with change creates kind of a vacuum for power. And people who are able to deal with that change a lot of times rise to power. Centrality is basically it's an organization strategy and the problems it's facing at the time. So being able to understand the financial problems that an organization could be having, or a financial crisis, obviously allows you to have power. They're not being able to be a substitute for you, meaning that just them not, an organization not being able to replace you. And then obviously having control over the decision-making process is another way of another source of power in an organization. Some other kind of ideas about it is the concept of hard power versus soft power. Hard power meaning more of a coercive type power, and a soft power meaning a person who's able to attract people and get them to do things kind of based on their personality. Just as important as it is to understand a power in an organization, you have to also understand politics. And understand, I don't care what organization you work for, there are politics in every one of them, and you can't measure it. It's not a numerical thing you can do. And some people see politics as very negative, dishonesty, kind of manipulative. But politics can also be a way of getting things done. And so you have to decide that for yourself. Whether you see it as a positive or negative doesn't really matter in our context. You have to understand how it works. And so one of the ways to navigate politics is to understand how to network. You want to, especially when you go into an organization at first, you want to kind of keep your mouth shut and learn. Learn the culture, learn where the power lays. You don't want to do anything that kind of surprises your boss, but particularly negative, meaning you just want to be what they expect you to be at first. You want to be an honest kind of team player. You want to be plugged in to kind of the network and grapevine that's in the organization. And you want to be seen as a person who can resolve conflicts as opposed to a person who causes conflicts. And so this is just kind of a graph kind of laying out the difference between networking and building coalitions and what comes from that. And we'll discuss this kind of more in depth. So these are kind of tactics for kind of dealing with politics. One is learning how to build coalitions. And so you get more power if you have other people with you. If you want to get things done, you have to get people who trust you, and you have to build a group of people who can wield power. You can deal with politics through outside experts. Meaning hiring somebody from the outside or bringing somebody in from the outside that supports your position. A lot of times this is seen as being objective when it's completely not. You want to have a network of contacts. So you want to within your organization and outside your organization, you want to have a group of people who can support you and can provide you with the resources and mechanisms to help get done what you want to get done. You want to understand about control and information. So again, within an organization, the people who control the flow of information have a lot of power. And so not only do you want to understand the information that's coming in and coming out of an organization, but you want to be able to respond to that information. Conflict is a whole nother issue. Whether we like it or not, guys, there's always conflict. And just like I said with politics, you can see it as a negative or as a positive. And some people struggle again to define what conflict is, but it's basically when people's interests collide. It's when we have a disagreement about how things should be done. And so conflict can kind of appear in a bunch of different places within the organization. From a horizontal deal, you can have conflict between people that are representing different departments, but they're on the same level within the organization. And then you can have vertical conflict. This is more of when there's a conflict between the people at the top of the hierarchy and the people down the chain. So it's real important, if you want to become a person who's in a leadership management type of role, that you understand kind of how conflict works, how it comes about, and how to resolve it. People who are able to do this a lot of times find themselves moving up the ladder much quicker. And so there are kind of a lot of sources of conflict within an organization. Differentiation creates conflict because different departments or subunits within an organization can have different goals, different philosophies on how to run them. And so they can become at odds over who's in charge of what, whose boundaries are who wields power over the other one. And this leads to kind of an interdependence, meaning that some groups or some subunits, some departments are much more dependent than others, while some are completely independent. And so obviously when somebody is dependent on somebody else, there's the chance that conflict's going to arise, which leads to this concept of formalization. Formalizing roles and standard ways of operating can cause conflict. There are some departments within an organization that have to be very structured. For instance, accounting. There are some that don't. And so obviously when those two groups interact, there's a chance you're going to have conflict. There's always competition over resources. There's differences in how to reward people. And maybe the ability to reward people. And then there's the concept of having issues over decision making and how much roles each department has over decision making. And so we want to come up with some strategies to manage this conflict. And the ideal situation for a sport manager is to change what's going on, change the behavior. That's what the root of the conflict is. That may not always be easy to do, so we have to come up with ways to deal with this stuff. So kind of a first type of strategy is just authority. And what that is basically somebody from the top steps in and deals with it. People may not like how it's dealt with, but it comes from the top, and so that's a way of dealing with it. Another one might be kind of either separating out or potentially merging people who are having conflicts. So if two departments are dependent on each other, maybe merge them. Or if they're not dependent on each other, separate them, and that deals with the conflict. Potentially increasing resources. If that is such an issue, then we have to come up with creative ways to either save money, which allows us to have more resources, or generate more wealth as a way to have more resources. Another strategy is integrating devices. And so basically that might be using kind of a committee or a small group of people to come up with ways to deal with conflict. And so you get people from different parts of your organization together, you bring those people together, and you come up with ways to solve the issues that are facing the organization. And people a lot of times see that as a representative type way of doing things. You can just flat out confront it and negotiate the conflict. You get people together face to face, and you come up with a way to solve your problems. Again, it's a very forward-facing type of deal. You can bring in a third party to negotiate. You see this a lot in like arbitration in baseball, where you have a conflict that just can't be handled inside the organization. You bring a third person that's able to deal with that conflict. And then another way is to help units within an organization develop their own goals. And so sometimes by giving kind of smaller groups within the organization more goals, it tends to have them buy into their role within the organization. And if they're achieving their goals of that small department, then they're achieving the bigger goals of the organization. And then kind of last couple of things, you can rotate jobs, meaning allow people to go work temporarily with another group to see what it is that they're doing, so they're able to kind of relate to them. And then learning to manage issues. So there are a lot of external issues that can have an impact on what goes on within your organization. And so we want to kind of be aware of the external trends versus the internal trends, and make sure that we don't develop a gap between those two that creates a conflict. And that's just being aware of what's going on, not only inside but outside your organization. And then you can also stimulate conflict. Sometimes there's a reason to have conflict rather than reduce it. Sometimes conflict creates change and innovation. It's kind of like the concept of when things are stressful and going bad, sometimes you get the best out of people. So it's not always a bad thing. And so just some ways to stimulate conflict within an organization is introduce new blood, bring in new people, manipulate communication. You can create information within an organization that causes tensions to run high. This is sometimes seen as an ethical question of whether it's a good tactic or not. And you can create competition between groups. And this will naturally create conflict, again, that we're trying to make as a positive thing. So all this conflict that we're talking about in this politics and stuff creates stress. And it creates stress in our body. And understand, we have a kind of a happy median in our body that we're trying to achieve, and it's always being pulled back and forth. So some things we can do to kind of help ourselves deal with stress is we want to eat right. We want to exercise. We want to learn to manage our time right. We want to try to think positively instead of negatively. And then there are some tools, relaxation, stuff like that, and support network that can help us deal with managing our stress. And understand these are kind of this tug of war that's going on between what's the ideal amount of stress, because it's different. For me, I like stress in my life. It helps me. If I don't have stress going on, then I don't know what's going on. I'm not very motivated to do anything. So I need there to be a little bit of stress in order for me to get things accomplished. So guys, I hope you enjoyed that. I look forward to kind of seeing what you guys come up with the discussions this week.